presentation that we have today is by Vrinda Dalmiya, University of Hawaii. We know Vrinda's work in care ethics, feminist epistemology, environmental philosophy, comparative philosophy, and her books, Caring to Know, Comparative Care Ethics, and Feminist Epistemology, and the Mahabharata. And so her talk today is From Epistemology to Justice, Thinking Through a Cross-Cultural Exemplar. Vrinda.
Okay, so thank you, Roger, and all the organizers who have put together this virtual political space of dialogue, and of course for including me in the conversation. So unfortunately, I didn't think of writing out a shortened version of my paper, so you'll just have to watch me as I bumble through summarizing it. So my paper echoes, interestingly, some of the framework of David's paper, which we just heard. And it speaks to epistemology and the social dimensions of knowledge as being relevant for justice. And it's also similar in taking a virtue theoretic turn as a supplement to the hunt for minimal principles of justice. So I concentrate on acquiring certain kinds of dispositions in order to bring about a just geopolitical order, rather than formulating rules or principles. However, when I'm talking about epistemology, I introduce certain ideas from feminist epistemology, and I talk about, I gesture towards how power can affect knowing and the possibility of critical debates that we have been emphasizing in this session. Secondly, when I'm making the virtue theoretic turn, I speak of emulating an admirable ethical agent from the different tradition of the Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata. So methodologically, there's also a difference, and I want to say that I focus on the non-ideal circumstances of contemporary reality. And I think towards justice by starting with theorizing injustices in our society. And the particular kind of injustice that I start with is the notion of epistemic injustice. So my first hypothesis within this framework is that global injustice rests on epistemic injustice. Therefore, epistemic injustice must be eradicated or eliminated in order to establish a just geopolitical order. So now let us come to the central concept of epistemic injustice. The term has been made popular by Miranda Fricker in recent times, but before her, the concept is actually prevalent, as has been pointed out, by in the works of feminists and other philosophers of color. So the notion of epistemic injustice references the unfair disadvantaging of people in their capacity as knowers. So it is not an inequality of resources, but an inequality in participation in meaning making. There are two kinds of epistemic injustice, the two main kinds of epistemic injustice which are important for our purposes. The first is testimonial injustice. And this is a case where prejudices reduce the credibility of a speaker. So for example, I ignore what a speaker has to say because I don't consider him or her to be an adequate, as having adequate epistemic authority. So this undermining of her epistemic authority undermines her ability to contribute to the development of knowledge. So this is testimonial injustice. The second is what is called hermeneutic injustice, and this is a more structural notion. And it refers to the situation where alternative worldviews are rendered unintelligible given the mainstream conceptual framework of understanding reality. And this happens because experiences at the margins do not contribute to the construction of concepts or the pool of concepts that are used for meaning making, even making sense of the notion of justice. And the typical example of this is the concept of even the word sexual harassment. And this becomes relevant, I think, for the discussions we've been having about the necessity of having a common language. The point is that if and when women as marginalized subjects, when their experiences did not figure as important, there was no concept of sexual harassment. And as a result, their oppression was remained unintelligible to us. So what language we use, what concepts we use in our language, and I'm jumping between language and concepts here, is dependent on whose experiences we take seriously. Now, both forms of testimonial and hermeneutic injustices are forms of epistemic exclusion. But what is important for our purposes today is to see that such exclusion prevents the flow of knowledge across borders and across power lines. For example, take the case of testimonial injustice. So if I believe that African Americans are unreliable, then there is no uptake of what they might have to offer when in a dialogue. And this epistemically, this erasure of them as contributors, as knowers, epistemically stymies us. Secondly, take the other example of ignoring the lived experiences of marginalized communities, say the indigenous communities. If we don't consider their lived experiences as epistemically important, then the radical potential of their land-based identities is eliminated, is erased. We have no way of engaging with this as an alternative solution to our current climate crisis. So the point I'm trying to make here, that epistemic injustice or forms of epistemic injustice leads to our not knowing, all right? Things which can be known and which are there, concepts and ideas which are prevalent. But apart from this not knowing, the notion of epistemic injustice involves what is also called meta-blindness. Now, this is a term made popular by Jose Medina's work, and where he says that in such cases, not only am I ignorant of what these erased subjects. No, not only am I ignorant, but I do not know that I do not know. And epistemic injustices, therefore, are designed to persist. And this is what makes them so pernicious and difficult to dismantle. Remember that I began by suggesting that epistemic injustices had to be dismantled in order to reach global justice. So my second step then is that I need to dismantle epistemic injustice and its associated meta-blindness, not by articulating principles, but by being a certain way. So epistemic injustice is prevented by a virtue theoretic move by acquiring certain epistemic virtues or certain dispositions. Now, how do I acquire these dispositions? Again, given within the framework of virtue epistemology, this is through emulating exemplars. And the exemplar I have in mind here is an exemplar called Shibi, the king Shibi from the Mahabharata time. And so my suggestion is that if I emulate Shibi, then one can acquire the disposition to eliminate epistemic injustice and thereby secure global justice, or at least be on that path. Now, a significant part of my paper is concerned with the analysis of the Shibi story. And I suggest a non-traditional analysis, and I'm not going into those details. All that is that I want to emphasize is that the moral message of this incident lies in Shibi failing as an ethical agent and yet being lauded as an exemplary moral agent. So it's a very paradoxical notion of an exemplary moral agent. Shibi is, on my reading, steeped in uncertainty. He doesn't know what or how to proceed to solve his ethical dilemma. He accepts the failure of the principles he was wedded to in solving his ethical dilemma. And yet, he is lauded as an agent, all right? So, and as an agent, he is committed to acting. But clearly, this action has to occur in the space of uncertainty and in the space of the failure of his adopted principle. So I read Shibi as accepting what I call epistemic vulnerability as a moral agent. So in emulating Shibi, we are told to embrace epistemic vulnerability or uncertainty. And this embrace of uncertainty will lead to dismantling epistemic injustice. So the final step in my argument is to show how an embrace of epistemic vulnerability is linked to dismantling epistemic injustice, and specifically dismantling the meta-blindness associated with epistemic injustice. And for this step, let me read, I'll just read a couple of sentences from my paper. Existing epistemic frameworks give more power to some and marginalize others. Consequently, the dominant have a lot to lose if they entertain cognitive alternatives. After all, these alternatives could reject the system in use and rock the status quo of which we are the beneficiary. An epistemic master identity, therefore, is better off simply by ignoring other frameworks or absorbing their differences into the pre-given scheme in use. Now, epistemic alternatives are made irrelevant and invisibilized through postures of certainty. We don't need to look at alternatives, for example, if we are so certain that we are right. Consequently, uncertainty can become a resource for dismantling the privilege-preserving habit of avoiding genuine epistemic alternatives. On the corporeal level, the outside is a threat. Others can hurt us through violence. But then others can also be a source of comfort. And this is on the physical level. Similarly, there is a flip side to the epistemic outside. Alternative systems, which are the epistemic outside, can threaten existing sense-making structures, but they can also be the source of new and surprising solutions, the spring of cognitive enrichment. Shibi's uncertainty leaves him with not knowing what to do. But crucially, this not knowing also creates a space to look beyond, to look to others for the radically new. Shibi's predicament becomes an occasion for undercutting the tunnel vision of the master and the ground for epistemic inclusion. In other words, uncertainty forces us to be epistemically open to the outside. Admiring Shibi chips away at the affective base of our willful ignorances, which is grounded in not wanting or not needing to depend on others. So just to pull all these strands together, I summarize by saying, first, global justice requires eliminating epistemic injustice. Eliminating epistemic injustice requires weakening of our meta-blindness. Meta-blindness is unsettled by embracing the notion of epistemic vulnerability. Therefore, cultivating epistemic vulnerability is the minimal condition for a just geopolitical order. That's it. Thank you. And there's no need to show what I have. Roger.
Thank you very much, Vrinda. The first questions then go to Michael and David.
Yes, I have a comment that comes from an old leftist, very old leftist. You seem to be arguing that the end of epistemic injustice requires an epistemological or psychological transformation of the people who enforce epistemic injustice, and not of the people who suffer from it. You want the masters to become vulnerable, but we certainly don't want the oppressed to be more vulnerable. I kept thinking as you were talking of that old slogan from my youth, the liberation of the workers must be the work of the workers themselves. The liberation of women from epistemic injustice must be the work of the women themselves, not the work of the capitalists, not the work of the misogynists. So what do you make of that kind of an argument?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I mean, obviously, I need to complicate my argument here. You're quite right that the oppressed and the marginalized need to have an epistemic voice. And I think the body, what I am appealing to, does not deny that. I'm committed to saying that voices at the margins have alternative notions of justice, injustice, what is right, what is wrong. The problem arises because these voices are erased and we don't take them into account when we are crafting our policy decisions. So therefore, at this level, there is work to be done by the masters or the dominant also. So, and this, as you rightly pointed out, is a work of self-cultivation, where I am willing to step back from my privilege and listen to these voices coming from the margins. And I would say that stepping back from privilege, the ability to step back from privilege requires a lot of work and a whole set of epistemic dispositions, which the feminist literature needs to work on. That would be my response. Does it do anything?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Vrinda. David?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you said in your paper. At one point in the written version, you speak of the need for, quote, a more regulatory psychic substratum that grounds acquiring of virtues and vices. And I take it this has to do with acceptance of vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah.
And I take it then that, you know, that's where Michael's question comes in. Something like that was bubbling up in my mind while you were speaking, which is besides just the stickiness, as you put it, of our current epistemic resources, which we all display. And I think that's part of what the Zhuangzi is addressing, that stickiness and stubbornness of how we currently view the world. Those who are in advantaged positions of power have additional motivations, have those resources stick.
Right.
But I guess one thing that occurred to me, in your paper, you mentioned how Western feminists could need to listen to their Southern counterparts. And so that brings to mind the fact that the lines between oppressor and oppressed get kind of complicated. And they're by no means all line up in one direction or the other. And so in many ways, perhaps most of us have the obligation to unstick ourselves, to become more vulnerable, because in a lot of ways we have investments in our ways of viewing things that shore ourselves up. So I wonder if that's in part what you might say.
Yes, and I would agree with your gloss on that, David. And and I would just like to add that you're quite right that the lines of oppressor and oppressed become very complicated, and it's not just our delving into the feminist literature makes this clear. It's not just a divide between the East and the West, or whatever, North or South. It's what's happening in between, and the intersectionalities of class and gender also complicate these power relations. But what's important, I think, for our discussion is to realize that these complications affect very concretely the possibility of having critical dialogue, which we have all conceded in this session to be necessary for justice, for global justice. And what I'm trying to do is get at that underbelly, as it were, or the substratum. And one way I suggest is through the politics of vulnerability, where we don't think of just certain minorities as vulnerable, but extend the notion to everyone. And remember, in the example, in the exemplar I use, Shibi is a king, he's a political leader. And on my reading, he is taught the lesson of vulnerability, even though he's politically not vulnerable at all.
Very nice. Thank you, David. Vrinda. May?
Thank you very much, Vrinda. I enjoyed your paper, and I'm wondering, I mean, this is correct. To be epistemically vulnerable is to know that one doesn't know and hence be open, right? This is the human wisdom that Socrates acknowledges that he has. But whereas Socrates has something more to go on, I'm just wondering about the substance, right? Where do you go from here once you accept your vulnerability? How does one then, being open to all of these options and wisdoms that are offered to you, how does one choose, and how does one know that one's choice is not simply arbitrary, and how does one prevent oneself from slipping into indecisiveness? For instance, I'm so uncertain that I can't decide which of these multiple options is the right one for any situation. So how does one move toward knowledge? Thank you.
Okay, I think there are two parts, or I would like to respond to you in two parts. The second is what you said at the end, and that how does this celebration of uncertainty and epistemic openness prevent, doesn't this such openness lead to indecisiveness? And that is a move which is very important for me to resist. And because moral life is not a life of not knowing what to do. It is a life of doing. So the point over here is that I think the notion of epistemic vulnerability in this sense has to be linked to an alternative notion of action and a theory of action which is not necessarily linked to certain belief, but, and particularly political action and maybe, things like hope. So where I'm making political and ethical interventions, not based on certain beliefs about the outcomes, but on alternatives to certain belief. And one such I suggest is that of hope, but this needs to be fleshed out. And obviously, the other question is that when I am open to all these options, which are, different and disagreeing with each other, how do I make a choice? And this is where I will fall back on what the previous two papers have underscored so forcefully, that there is no other option but to continue the debate. And it is through this process of debating and answering objections that we fine-tune whatever epistemic choices we make at the moment. And what my paper has tried to focus on is how to make such epistemic debates at least mindful of the differential power locations of different knowers conducting that debate.
Thank you very much, May and Vrinda. We have time for one more question. Amita?
Yes. Thank you, Vrinda, for your clear argument. But I just don't have any question, but I would like to support your argument more strongly by bringing in Amartya position of justice. What actually he has talked about is what will motivate a person who is not vulnerable to be able to step back from his or her privileges is not only, this openness or open discussion, but it is, is to be supplemented by a sort of, say, empathy and attitude of care. And what he has pointed out is this, that somebody who is powerful, somebody who is not vulnerable, will not take this step only just by realizing his vulnerability or her vulnerability, but just like a caring mother or a benevolent person caring for others, when he realizes his weakness as well as which is shares with others, he will be, helped by this attitude of empathy and also caring for others. And I think this is in line with your care ethics. And if you bring in these considerations, maybe your argument will be more strong. That's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you, Amitadeep. And any support is very welcome. So I appreciate that. Just one sort of comment though on putting the focus on empathy over here. Empathy obviously also has can be vicious, can get skewed because of, again, differential power. And that is why I think I would say that even when empathizing, we need a prior step of self-reflexivity, which makes us aware of our limits. And that is what I'm trying to motivate through the notion of epistemic vulnerability, to know my limits, even when I go out to empathize with others.
Thank you very much, Vrinda. It's been a wonderful session. We've come to an end. The next session is 4.5 hours from now, so it gives us a time for a nice dinner. And I'll see everybody at the next session.